On May 20th, 2025, after spending 13 years on death row, Matthew Lee Johnson was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville State Penitentiary. In this video, we will find out what his last meal was and what his final words were. But to understand why this man died strapped to a gurney with poison flowing through his veins, we need to go back to a Sunday morning that started like any other and ended in unimaginable horror. May 20th, 2012, Garland, Texas. The sun hasn't been up long when 76-year-old Nancy Harris unlocks the doors to the convenience store where she works. It's a routine she knows by heart. Nancy is a great-grandmother. She's lived a full life, raised her family, watched her children have children of their own. At 76, most people would be enjoying retirement. But Nancy still shows up to work, greeting her regular customers with that familiar smile. 7 a.m. rolls around, and a man walks through the door. His name is Matthew Johnson. He's 36 years old, and hidden in his hands are two items that will transform this ordinary morning into a nightmare: a water bottle filled with lighter fluid and a cigarette lighter. Johnson doesn't browse the aisles. He doesn't pretend to shop. He walks straight to the counter where Nancy stands. And then, without a word of warning, he douses her with the lighter fluid. Imagine that moment. The chemical smell burning your nostrils. The cold liquid soaking through your clothes. The sudden, terrifying realization that your life is in someone else's hands. Nancy does what anyone would do. She cooperates. Her hands shake as she opens the register and hands over the cash. Take it, just take it and leave. But Johnson isn't satisfied with money. He reaches across the counter and rips the rings off her fingers. Personal jewelry, probably gifts from her late husband, yanked off with such force it must have hurt. He grabs cigarettes, lighters, whatever else he can reach. And then he does something that defies comprehension. He flicks the lighter. The flames consume Nancy instantly. Her screams fill the store as Johnson turns and walks toward the exit. Not running, not panicking, walking. And on his way out, he stops the candy aisle and casually pockets some chocolate bars, as if grabbing a snack after committing one of the most horrific crimes Texas has ever seen. Behind him, Nancy Harris is burning alive. She stumbles to a sink inside the store, desperately splashing water on herself. But the flames won't stop. They're too intense, too aggressive. She runs outside, still on fire, screaming for anyone who can help her. Her clothing has essentially become a second skin of flames. By pure chance, a police officer is nearby. He hears the screams and comes running with a fire extinguisher. He manages to put out the flames, but what's left is almost too devastating to describe. Nancy has suffered burns across most of her body: 2nd degree, 3rd degree, 4th degree. The kind of burns that don't just destroy skin. They destroy everything beneath it. Paramedics rush her to the hospital. Doctors do everything they can. But after 5 days of agony, 5 days that her family describes as the worst of their lives, Nancy Harris dies on May 25th, 2012. While Nancy fights for her life in the hospital, police are hunting for her attacker. But they don't have to look long. The store's surveillance cameras captured everything in crystal clear detail. And Nancy herself, showing incredible strength, managed to describe the man who attacked her before she lost consciousness. Within an hour, officers spot Matthew Johnson in a nearby neighborhood. He's shirtless, sweating, carrying the stolen lighters and cash. When they arrest him, he doesn't resist. He doesn't run. What's he going to say? The evidence is literally in his hands. The arrest brings Nancy's family some small relief. At least they caught him. At least he won't hurt anyone else. But Nancy is still in the hospital, still suffering. And when she finally passes away 5 days later, The charge against Johnson changes from assault to capital murder. Capital murder in Texas means you're eligible for the death penalty. Fast forward to 2013. Matthew Johnson sits in a Dallas County courtroom facing trial for his life. The prosecution has an open and shut case. There's surveillance footage. There's Nancy's description of her attacker. There's the physical evidence, the lighters, the cash, everything found on Johnson when police arrested him. There's even the testimony of the police officer who put out the flames. Johnson's defense team knows they can't claim innocence. The evidence is overwhelming, so they take a different approach. They try to explain how someone could do something this monstrous. They tell the court about Johnson's life, his childhood trauma, his decades-long battle with drug addiction, the demons he's been fighting since he was young. And then Johnson himself takes the stand. This is rare in capital murder cases. The defendant usually stays silent. But Johnson wants to speak. "I hurt an innocent woman," he tells the jury, tears streaming down his face. "I took a human being's life. It was not my intention to kill her or to hurt her, but I did." He admits he was high during the robbery, drunk and tweaking on about $100 worth of crack cocaine. He claims his mind was so clouded by drugs that he barely knew what he was doing. He says he only meant to scare Nancy with a lighter fluid, never to actually set her on fire. He calls himself the lowest scum of the earth. But here's the problem with that defense. Nancy Harris is still dead. Whether Johnson meant to kill her or just meant to terrify her doesn't change the fact that she died one of the most painful deaths imaginable. The jury sees right through it. The prosecution hammers home the brutality of the crime. They show photos of Nancy's injuries, photos so graphic that some jurors look away. They point out Johnson's criminal history, his pattern of bad choices. The jury deliberates and returns with their verdict: guilty of capital murder. But the trial isn't over. In Texas, there's a second phase after a guilty verdict where the jury decides between life in prison or death. It's called the punishment phase, and this is where the prosecution has to prove that Johnson would be a future danger to society, one of the requirements for the death penalty in Texas. The prosecution argues that someone capable of setting an elderly woman on fire over a few $100s is exactly the kind of person who will kill again if given the chance. They bring up his past crimes, his drug addiction, his inability to stay clean. The defense fights back. They bring in Johnson's family members, his wife, his 3 daughters. They bring in former employers who testify that when he's sober, Johnson is actually a decent person, a caring father, someone who just can't break free from addiction. They argue that life in prison would be punishment enough. That execution is extreme. The jury disagrees. They sentence Matthew Lee Johnson to death by lethal injection. Johnson is transferred to the Pulaski Unit, Texas's death row facility. It's in Livingston, about 70 miles northeast of Houston. The conditions are harsh: 23-hour lockdown in a tiny cell, minimal human contact, the constant psychological weight of knowing you're scheduled to die. His attorneys immediately begin filing appeals. That's their job, to search every legal avenue, find any reason why the sentence should be overturned. They argue that the jury was wrong about Johnson being a future danger. Look at his behavior in prison, they say. He's been a model inmate. No violence, no disciplinary issues. He's not a threat to anyone. They point to his transformation behind bars. Johnson has thrown himself into faith-based programs. He writes letters to his daughters regularly, maintaining a relationship despite the prison walls between them. He expresses deep remorse for what he did. His attorneys argue this is proof of rehabilitation, but the appeals courts aren't convinced. Appeal after appeal gets denied. Years pass. Johnson's daughters grow up making trips to the prison, talking to their father through plexiglass, never able to hug him. His youngest daughter was just a small child when he was arrested. By the time she's a teenager, he's still on death row. The appeals process drags through 2015, 2016, 2017. Each year, his attorneys find new arguments, new reasons to delay. But each year, the courts say no. By 2024, they've exhausted almost every option. Johnson's case reaches the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. If the Supreme Court agrees to review his case, there's a chance his sentence could be overturned. They decline to hear it. That decision in 2024 essentially seals Johnson's fate. There's only one option left: clemency. In April 2025, with his execution date just weeks away, Johnson's attorneys file a clemency petition with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Clemency is essentially asking for mercy. They're not saying Johnson is innocent. They can't. They're asking the board to commute his sentence from death to life in prison without parole. Nancy Harris's family is given a chance to weigh in. They make it clear they want the sentence carried out. For them, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice. Nancy suffered for 5 days before dying. Why should her killer get to live? On May 17, 2025, just 3 days before Johnson's scheduled execution, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles meets to vote on his clemency petition. The vote is unanimous, denied. Johnson's attorneys try one last desperate maneuver. They file an emergency lawsuit claiming the scheduling of the execution violated proper procedures. It's a technicality, a last-ditch effort. The courts strike it down within 48 hours. Matthew Johnson is out of options. His execution is scheduled for May 20th, 2025, exactly 13 years to the day after he killed Nancy Harris. His final days are spent in a holding cell in Huntsville, where all Texas executions take place. He's allowed visitors, his spiritual advisors, prison chaplains. His wife and 3 daughters come to say goodbye. Popular culture has turned the death row last meal into something almost mythical. Convicted killers ordering elaborate spreads, lobster, steak, pie ice cream, whatever they want for one final indulgence. But Texas doesn't do that anymore. So when Matthew Johnson woke up on May 20th, 2025, knowing it was his last day alive, there was no special breakfast waiting, no comfort food from his childhood, no favorite dish to ease his final hours. He got whatever every other inmate in the Texas prison system got that day. As the afternoon wears on, 6 p.m. approaches. That's when Texas conducts executions, early evening after the workday ends, when witnesses can attend. Prison officials come to Johnson's cell. It's time. They escort him down the hallway to the execution chamber. Guards secure straps across his chest, his arms, his legs. IV lines are inserted into both of Johnson's arms. These lines will deliver pentobarbital, the drug Texas uses for lethal injections, in high doses. On the other side of a large window, witnesses are gathered. 3 of Nancy Harris's sons are there, their wives, one of Nancy's granddaughters. They've waited 13 years for this moment. 13 years of court dates, appeals, delays. Now it's finally happening. The warden approaches Johnson and asks the traditional question, "Do you have any final words?" Matthew Johnson turns his head toward the window where Nancy's family sits. "As I look at each one of you," he begins, his voice calm but heavy with emotion, "I can see her on that day." The room is silent except for his voice. "I please ask for your forgiveness. I never meant to hurt her." Nancy's family doesn't react visibly. They've heard him apologize before in court in written statements. Words don't bring their mother back. But Johnson continues, "I pray that she's the first person I see when I open my eyes, and I spend eternity with her." He turns his attention to his own family, watching from a separate viewing area. "To my wife and daughters," he says, "I'm sorry for giving up on you." Because that's what this execution represents, giving up. Accepting that he'll never walk free, never be a real father, never have a life outside these walls. He thanks his spiritual advisors. Then, in a moment that shows he's still thinking about the men he's leaving behind on death row, he offers them encouragement. Continue on. Jesus is the way. His final statement is brief. "I've made wrong choices, and now I pay the consequences. I'm done, warden." The clock reads 6 p.m. A doctor signals to the IV team. The pentobarbital begins flowing through the lines into Johnson's veins. Within seconds, his body starts to react. He gasps a few times, involuntary reflexes, as the drug hits his system. Then something unexpected happens. He starts snoring, loudly. After about 30 seconds, the snoring stops. His chest stops rising and falling. His body goes completely still. At 6:53 p.m., 26 minutes after the injection began, a doctor checks Johnson's vital signs one final time and nods to the warden. Time of death, 6:53 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Matthew Lee Johnson is dead. On the other side of the glass, Nancy Harris's family rises quietly and files out of the room. They don't speak to reporters. They don't make statements. They've gotten what they came for. Johnson's execution is the fourth carried out by Texas in 2025. It won't be the last. For Nancy Harris's family, there's no celebration, no sense of closure. One of her daughters-in-law said it best years ago, "You don't heal. Days get easier, but there's no day where it's totally healed." Because that's the truth about cases like this. Nancy is still gone. Her grandchildren still grew up without her. The holidays still have an empty chair at the table. The execution doesn't change any of that. And Matthew Johnson's family? They've lost someone too. His daughters will never see their father again. His wife is a widow. His mother has buried her son. Two families destroyed by one terrible decision made on a Sunday morning in 2012. What we're left with are questions that don't have easy answers. Does the death penalty serve justice or just perpetuate more loss? Can someone who commits a horrific crime truly change? Does execution provide closure for victims' families? Would life in prison have been enough? These are the questions that linger long after the gurney has been wheeled away and the witnesses have gone home. This is where Matthew Johnson's story ends. On a gurney in Huntsville, Texas, with poison in his veins and regret in his final words. The only certainty is this: Nancy Harris died horribly in 2012, and Matthew Johnson died by the state's hand in 2025.